Well, I thought I'd have another go at a bit of philosophical reflection. Another one for that series on philosophy and philosophers. So I did Socrates last time, and the obvious place to go from Socrates is Plato. Just a clarification on my intent here. I'm not intending on doing what would be considered an appropriate lecture or something, because there's got to be, I haven't looked, but I imagine there's a lot of videos out there on Plato, and many of them would be high quality lectures by people with doctorates and lifetime of study. But I'm taking this series more from a point of view of my journey with these people and these ideas, rather than some sort of attempt to put together a lecture set. So obviously, well, if you watch the previous one on Socrates, you'll know that would have been in my early 20s, I guess, when I stumbled upon philosophy and read a bunch of introductions, and most of them started with Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. That was a bit, there must have been something in the water. Plato was Socrates' student and Aristotle was Plato's student. And in a very short little moment of time, these major ideas that still persist today basically had their genesis. Although I think that ideas have their time. I think that there's no way that Socrates or Plato were going to come up with calculus, but two independent people came up with calculus, simultaneously. So calculus's time was obviously ripe at that point. So there must have been something culturally, something about the time and the circumstance that made it right for this kind of thinking. So I won't speculate on what that was, but I kind of feel that has to be the case, or how else would you have these three people that have been so influential that are just, bang, bang, bang. So what's the most important aspect of, what are the key things for me with Plato? Well, obviously, he wrote what we know of Socrates' ideas. So that's significant in itself. But it is very hard to know what Socrates thought and what Plato did, because they just merge. So it all kind of melds into one. Whereas Aristotle, who initially was a student of Plato's, very much developed his own thinking, and is in contrast to Plato. So it's kind of broad spectrum, a broad sort of idea. I don't know, it's a bit like, are you a Beatles person or a Stones person? People tend to be Plato or Aristotle, sort of. I mean, clearly a gross oversimplification and generalisation, but Plato was all about transcendent, non-material ideas, and Aristotle really was grounded in nature. I'll speak more of that when I talk about Aristotle. But Plato, and I think that Plato's ideas, it's again another sort of gross oversimplification, but I've heard people or read people sort of saying Plato introduced all the ideas, all the big concepts, and everyone else has just been filling in the pieces. And I guess that because now when you get into philosophers now and they're working academically, they have to be so niche. There's specialisation on specialisation, and so you can't really be the generalist that people once were. I mean, PhD stands for Doctor of Philosophy, and people get PhDs in all sorts of things that are not philosophy, but philosophy used to be a broad term that covered a whole lot of different things, including what we would now call physics and science and mathematics. So the specialisation that as we see it now, wasn't the case, and certainly not when Plato was around and he was writing. So he delves into all sorts of things, and he delves into metaphysics and moral theory, and what's called ontology, ideas of what it is to exist and to be. So at that time, you could be a much more general thinker, and I mean, because he had his academy, Plato, but not in the sense that we talk about a university now. So it was a different thing, is what I'm saying. So he wrote The Republic and Last Days of Socrates are the ones that I'm familiar with. I can't even tell you. I'm not going to do heaps of research and say this is a complete list of what he wrote, but I'm familiar with The Last Days of Socrates was the first one I read, and then I think I did read The Republic right the way through, but it's not it's not a novel that you can just sit down and get into the story. Not that I like novels particularly, but yeah, you know, it's not like reading something with a story so much. So I guess the first time, the first memory I have of Plato, and it's not a good one, in a sense, I was doing Year 7 non-elective music, and there was a casual teacher, and they were basically trying to keep the class busy, and we were meant to write something about what music meant. And I'd been playing the trumpet since I was 8, so probably 5 years by then, and been in bands and so forth. So I had fairly narrow but fairly strongly held beliefs about music. And among the various tidbits of information we're given that we were supposed to reflect in on this little written expression was that apparently Plato believed music played an important part in education. And so they dropped that out, and I was not in a good mood and didn't want to write anything particularly. And I don't have a clue what I wrote, but I wrote something that was basically scathing and probably very amusing and gritty for a 13-year-old, at least I thought so at the time. But I did manage to offend the music teacher, who later on became a teacher that I did elective music. Not that I even chose to do that. I kind of got coerced into doing it because I was a bit disgusted with well, I was a bit contrarian. So she took offence, and I got told it was like I'd committed a heresy, and after class I should know better, and being so musical, and how could I do that? But basically I was asked to do something I didn't want to do. So that's my first memory of Plato, is that he believed music should play an important part in education. I still don't know quite why that's authoritative, because he had a lot of ideas on things that I wouldn't endorse, and I don't think a lot of people would today. So I don't know, is it, using a name like Plato, does that give it some sort of inherited authority in some people's minds? But I actually really walked away from any form of formal education. When I was 16, I was absolutely browned off. I was scarred from school. It wasn't a good time, and philosophy kind of found me, but I didn't feel like it was doing. It wasn't playing the game, because I was just reading books, and I was reading the books that I found interesting. I wouldn't read anything but Wizard of Id and Foot Rot Flats for those that know, and Swamp, comics. For probably 4 or 5 years. Well, although I never counted reading stuff about electronics or mechanics as reading, so that was exempted. But I did find myself, when I encountered in philosophy, I was intrigued, and I started reading these introductions, and I could get some ideas about what was going on with. When I was reading Plato, I kind of lost the plot a bit as I was going further through, and they got more complex and built on each other. Plato is somewhere that you can start, and so one of the first things that really struck me is the analogy of the cave. So he talks of these people, and they're kind of held in place, I don't know, tied to something or whatever, and they're in a cave, and they can see a wall in front of them, but there's all sorts of stuff going on behind them, and there's the sun is behind that, or a fire or something, I don't remember, I think it was a fire, but anyway, light behind, and so the light is casting forward, and there's shadows being cast on the wall, and these people have never seen anything but the shadows. And they believe that the shadows are the real, and they hold opinions and whatever. Well, one of these people breaks free and turns around and sees the actual people, and sees what is the real. And they say, look, what you're seeing, it's not the real, it's this shadow, but the people who've never turned around and have no interest in turning around. They sort of stubbornly say, no, you're an idiot, you're a heretic, and then they come out, and they kind of come out of the cave into the light, and they see the world, and they're just amazed, and they go back and try to tell the people, and these people refuse to listen, they refuse to accept, and they live the rest of their lives just looking at the shadows. And of course it's the philosopher who breaks free and asks these questions. And I remember reading that, and I don't know, it just connected with me. I guess I'd always felt a bit of an outsider. There were people who held quite strong opinions about me, some positive and a number negative, and I never quite felt like I fitted in, really. And I got to think of myself as maybe being the person that was seeing the real. And I remember when I was reading that, and particularly when I hit that analogy of the cave, when I read stuff that really connects, it's like the page disappears, and I feel like I'm looking into something, and ideas just become, they come to me as I'm reading. I forget the words on the page, and I just have these sort of I don't know. It doesn't happen often, but it happened when I was reading that, and I remember feeling like I'd been staring into I had this thought that I was staring into this muddy pool, and you could see nothing below the surface. You wanted to see what's in this water, but it's just all muddied. But the longer I sat and read this stuff, it was like the mud started to settle, and you began to see these things that were obscured. And I had that as a vivid kind of image in my mind. I wasn't articulating it, but that was what I felt as I was reading these things. And so that was pretty, I don't know, it was just fascinating to me to have that. And Plato, as I read that, I think it was the first time I'd encountered that to do with philosophy. Other things about Plato, well, he had his theory of forms. And so he believed that there was a world of the perfect. There was a perfect everything. And that we had we were born like we. I don't know whether we were born. It was sort of a cyclic thing, not so much reincarnation, but he believed that we came from and we knew this perfect world, and when we were born, we came from this perfect world, and emerged into this imperfect world, and that the world we live in, there's nothing that's perfect. There's a perfect idea of a circle, but if you take any circular object that exists, or any drawn circle, and you measure it precisely enough, and you'll find that there will be points on its circumference that are not the radius away from the centre. And so there is nothing perfect in this world. But he thought that when we learned, we remembered, rather than taking on new information. We had this memory, this latent memory or something, this. And as we moved around the world, we remembered what we had once known, but we made the mistake of thinking that what are in effect shadows, going back to the shadow analogy, but what were just shadows were the real. And so we think that wheel is circular. Well, it's not. It's an approximation. It's an imperfect circle. And Plato had a definition of the perfect, and it's something that it cannot be improved on. It is the ideal. And so the perfect circle, it cannot be improved on because it is the perfect. And every form that there is, like chair or whatever, there is a perfect form of that thing, and that we call these things circles or squares or chairs or whatever because they resemble the perfect form, but they are never the perfect form. They're always a corrupt imitation or shadow. And that's an interesting idea, and I think as I look at some concepts like that's something that I thought a lot about, and I was thinking a lot about at the time that I was reading this initially, was Calvinism, John Calvin, and predestination. And as I was reading this sort of stuff and I was thinking about it more and more, I felt that, when in that theology, there's omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omnipresent are these four characters of the perfect God. So if God is not everywhere, then there's something could be added to God by him being somewhere else. If God is not all good, then there's something can be improved upon. If God is not all powerful, then God is less than perfect. And if he's not all good, did I say the same one twice? But yeah, but the interesting thing to me is even in that theology, the words that he used are Greek words: omnipresent, omnibenevolent, omnipotent, and not Jewish. And I think about the people who put together the canon of that theology. And they were Greek educated. We talk about Western and Eastern thought. Well, the Western thought comes from that sort of idea and from people like Plato and Aristotle. So I think that Plato's version of perfection and the perfect forms really is behind a lot of ideas that have driven certain doctrines and form what is now considered to be orthodox theology. And I don't. I feel that there's a mistake being made there. But for me personally, as I was reading Plato and reading commentary around Plato and noticing this idea of the shadow and the perfect and so forth, I was affected by those ideas because of the place I was at the time, and the sort of ideas that I was wrestling with. Wrestle, is that a word, or wrestle? But I think anyway, whatever. So obviously, there's way more to do with Plato than that. But the important thing for me is that he's talking about this other world that matters, not this world, not this physical world. It is the world of the perfect, and that's where when we die, we go back to the world of the perfect. He had political views about, he wanted a republic where people are appointed, not elected, and they benevolently rule over, the state, but they are, appointed and promoted according to merit. But unsurprisingly, it's the philosopher that is the right person to do this. And I think that he wasn't into democracy. It was sort of a benevolent republic. And he felt that if the average punter was left to do things, they don't even think about stuff much, and it'd all go fairly wrong. Of course, Churchill famously had his, this is the worst system of democracy, is the worst system of government except for all the rest. But Plato didn't think so. And I'm trying to summarise these things and not make them too long. You could do a whole series of many hours, and people have, I've no doubt. People spend their whole life really looking at Plato and what he thought and how it ripples down, and how people interpret those problems today, but all those ideas. But for me, those two things, the idea, the simile of the cave, and the idea of the forms, those are ideas that have carried through in my thinking to the present day, and they still inform how I think about a lot of things. I don't have to agree with the ideas or buy them. The shadow world is quite interesting. The idea that you can be just caught up and refuse to see what's to be seen. But there's a whole lot of different ways that idea has been described. But that impacted me when I first read it. And I remember being very, I don't know, moved is probably the wrong word, but it really affected me. And certainly his idea of the perfect, that's rippled through my thinking ever since I read it. And I guess I would say that a lot of the ideas that we encounter and will be encountering as I continue to talk about these things, or if you look at philosophy, when you first encounter them and when you look at them, some of them are very outdated and antiquated. I mean, Plato, there's a lot of thinking happened since. But remember the time that they were thinking in, and remember what was, common thought at the time, what the cultural norms were, and where he was working from, and if you look at those ideas, the ideas were profound that he raised, and what he wrote about, and it spawned, it's rippled through history, and so you don't have to get it right for it to matter. You just have to, you have to raise interesting and important questions and offer some thoughts about it, and then people can move on from there. So Plato absolutely did that, and it's absolutely not in the scope of what I'm trying to do in this sort of series of reflections. to do a comprehensive and appropriate do Plato justice. But those are I've really lived with those ideas, and kind of vividly remember the time that I first encountered them, and remember how I was affected by them. So yeah, that's the way I sort of want to go through these things, just reflecting and thinking about. And I mean, in this format, because I'm not doing a lot of prep and whatever, there's every chance I'll misquote. I looked up something about Aquinas's proofs and on ChatGPT to just see what it had to think, and it pointed out that the idea I was talking about was Anselm's, not Aquinas's, and I went, yes, it was. Ontological proof for the existence of God. So I'll misremember things, but that's not the point. It's really what I'm talking about here is just how these ideas have come to me, and how they've affected me, and how I remember them. And please feel free to point out if I slip up, but I'm not going to be too distraught, because I'm not trying to be 100% accurate. I'm just trying to share how these things have felt to me, and how they've affected me. All right, that'll do.